Okay, hello and welcome everyone. I am Dr. Adele Thomas. I'm a senior researcher with Climate Analytics at University of the Bahamas, and I will be moderating our session today. So thank you for joining this CONSTRAIN webinar on the IPCC's Working Group 1 6 Assessment Report, which focuses on the physical science of climate change. And there has been really lots of anticipation for the findings of this report and lots of speculation in particular about the critical issue of 1.5 degrees of warming. And so in the next hour, we will be unpicking the key findings from the report and the science behind it. And we'll be hearing some perspectives on the broader implications of the report. And we will then have time for questions and answers at the end. So we're very happy that you have come to join us today. So before we get started, some brief housekeeping. So please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available on the CONSTRAIN website. You are muted upon entry, as you may have seen already, and your video is disabled. So please make sure that that remains throughout. If you encounter any technical issues, then please submit those questions into the Q&A chat function, and our team will get back to you to help sort those out. And for questions, we will be having question and answer at the end after our presentations and panelists. So please submit those questions and comments during the webinar in the Q&A chat section, and our speakers will address them after the presentations. So to discuss some of the key findings from the report, I am very pleased to welcome our first set of speakers. We have Professor Piers Forster, Director of the Priestley International Center for Climate at University of Leeds. He was lead author for the IPCC's 4th and 5th reports and the special report on 1.5 degrees. He led a chapter for the 6th assessment report, where he was also a drafting author of the summary for policymakers. We also have Dr. Tamsin Edwards, who specializes in quantifying the uncertainties of climate model predictions, particularly for the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheet contributions to sea level rise. She is a lead author of the IPCC's 6th assessment report and a contributing author to the special report on the ocean and cryosphere. And we'll also be hearing from Professor Malte Munchausen, Director of the Climate and Energy College at the University of Melbourne. He is one of the lead authors of the IPCC 6th assessment report and also a core writing team member of the AR6 synthesis report. And so we're very pleased to be hearing from 3 of the authors of the Working Group 1 report. And with that, I turn it over to you, Piers.
Oh, yeah. Okay, everyone. That was a fantastic introduction, Adele, and it is so good to be with everyone today. Yeah, so I would really like to begin with a very brief introduction to what the IPCC report is, and we then go on to present some of the most interesting results. So the IPCC is a bit different than the average report, just because it gets commissioned by 195 world governments, which is the intergovernmental part of the report, and that does mean that governments do agree the summary of the report line by line in a kind of 2-week process. We've all just survived, and that also does mean the governments have particular tie into the report, and it directly feeds into the COP negotiations. And this report is very significant because it's the very first major update to the physical science since the last report in 2013. And the IPCC doesn't do research, it goes and looks at the peer review publications, and we've cited over 14,000 publications. So before I begin, I'd like to give a big shout out to the science community that have really done the background research, that we assess. Yeah, and because it's a big update, it does perhaps expectedly come with a lot of bad news, unfortunately, and this report does confirm that we're seeing unprecedented rates of change across the climate system currently, and we can absolutely be more certain than before that the changes are directly linked to our emissions of greenhouse gases. A particular advance that I'll be concentrating on in my very short talk today is the work that has been done on extremes. At the time of the fifth assessment report, we didn't have a good understanding of how they were changing and what the impact of our activities was. But we can unfortunately now be much more certain that these wildfires and flooding events and these kind of heat waves that are occurring all over the world today, they are getting worse, and they are almost directly caused, or our greenhouse gas emissions do play a significant part in those increases. And I think this is also something that has celebrated work and been done, because it's not just the scientists in the developed countries that are doing this work, it's the scientists all over the world that have come together to really try and pinpoint the effects of our activities, and we can really directly attribute a lot of the changes in the extremes to our emissions. So if you look at this diagram from the report, where you see the kind of black dots on the diagram is where we have a very kind of high degree of confidence that the extremes we see today are really connected to our activities. Just because of the way extremes work, unfortunately, we are kind of witnessing this acceleration of the extremes. Just so this is shown on this diagram in the kind of summary, and what it indicates, for example, is that perhaps an extreme kind of heat wave that occurred once every 50 years is currently now occurring 4 or 5 times within that 50-year kind of period. And if we get to 1.5 degrees, they could begin occurring 10 times within a kind of 50-year kind of period. And not only will they occur more often, they'll also be more intense when they do occur. But we not only want to talk to you today about the kind of bad news that comes from the report, we want to also talk to you about some of the good news that comes from the report too. So the first good news is that we're able to bring lots of scientific lines of evidence together to be able to place a much tighter constraint on our projections. So we can be much more certain of the effect of what our future choices and our activities will make for climate change. And a particularly important thing to say is that a lot of the extremes will go on going up as the surface temperature goes up, but if we can control surface temperature, there is quite good evidence that a lot of the extremes won't go on getting worse. And the other thing, the report to tell us that if we can take very significant fishing cuts within the next 10 years, then we have an opportunity to limit the unprecedented warming trend we're seeing currently. And if we do that, and we also get to these net zero 2050 targets, there is a distinct opportunity that we can perhaps prevent warming keeping below 1.5 degrees, or at least not going too far above that 1.5 degrees. And the other thing the report shows us is that these net zero targets, they really work in the way that if we do achieve net zero carbon dioxide, we don't expect any further warming. And if we go further and get to net zero greenhouse gases, there is the potential to begin to reverse some of those temperature changes. Yeah, so I just end with this one diagram where we look at these kind of 5 listed pathways. And if you look at the one on the left-hand side of this, this is the lowest emission pathway we talk about, and this is where you see the potential to keep those temperatures below 1.5 degrees. So I would now pass over to Tamsin, who will talk about some of the longer term changes.
Thanks, Piers. I'm having some trouble with my mouse cursor. Yes, thank you. Let's see if I can do these slide shares. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll talk about the next part of the presentation, which is focusing a bit more on my area of the oceans and cryosphere, the chapter 9 that I was a co-author of. We have here an example of what Piers was talking about, of this much more comprehensive assessment of human influence being the main driver of many aspects of climate change. So hot extremes we've heard about, but also ocean warming, ocean acidification, so the changes in pH that we see from CO2 dissolving into the oceans, and changes, as I say, in the cryosphere, in the frozen areas of the planet. We're the main driver of the glacier retreat since the 1990s, which is unprecedented in at least 2,000 years, of the decrease in Arctic sea ice since the year that I was born, which is the lowest in 1,000 years, and also sea level rise as well since at least 1971, and the rate of sea level rise since 1900 is the fastest in 3,000 years. So let me try and figure out how to, there we go, thank you. And an important emphasis in the summary for policymakers around the oceans and cryosphere is the idea of irreversibility, that many changes are irreversible for centuries to millennia, and some of those are already committed. For the ocean temperatures, our past emissions of greenhouse gases have already committed us to future warming of the oceans, and that will be irreversible for centuries to millennia. The Greenland ice sheet will continue to lose ice this century and longer, and actually the glaciers as well, the mountain and polar glaciers of the world, are already committed to further melting for decades to centuries. And sea level will rise this century and beyond, and in fact will also be irreversible on centuries to millennia because of that slow response of both the ocean warming, which leads to sea level rise through the expansion of the water, and the losses in particular from the ice sheets, which go on for such a long time. There is some note of optimism, certainly on these changes, that some of these could be, that some changes could be slowed or even stopped by limiting warming. And I think if we look at the next slide, thank you, this is kind of illustrated in part with this graphic for sea level rise. This is showing sea level rise since 1900 over this century for the different emission scenarios that we've already seen. And what it shows, of course, well, that sea level will rise, as I said, this century, no matter what we do, no matter how strongly we reduce our emissions. If we look at the lowest of the scenarios, the very low emissions, 119, the 1.5 degree scenario, more or less, the best estimate there is a little over 0.5 meter of sea level rise since 1900. If we look at the upper end of the shading, that's the intermediate scenario 370, we're tracking perhaps a little under that in our current trajectory of emissions. The upper end of that likely range is a bit over 1 meter, 1.1 meters since 1900. And then the very high greenhouse gas emissions scenario there is actually one that shows a great degree of influence on the ice sheets, and particularly the Antarctic ice sheet. And we have tried to separate out the, oh, sorry, back on the previous slide still. Thank you. We've tried to separate out the possibility of the deep uncertainty we have about the ice sheets with this dash line here, approaching 2 meters by the end of the century, which we've called this low likelihood, high impact outcome of basically very high end sea level rise if the ice sheets respond very strongly to climate change. That's based on expert elicitation as well as the ice cliff instability hypothesis that's been around for the last few years, led by Rob DeConto and others. And finally, for 2300, this shows this even more starkly. The zooming out on the graphic, we've got the 21st century is shown on the bottom left there, and more or less to scale. Actually, the scale is even compressed. These are the projections for sea level rise in the year 2300. We just have it for 2 scenarios here, the low scenario 126 and the very high scenario 585. And the upper ends of both of those bars are higher than the special report for the oceans and cryosphere. There's been new literature. It's effectively, those bars are effectively showing the range of the literature plus some extra assessments we made for the report in the chapter. But you might be able to see there's a dashed arrow above the red bar, and that shows the direction of the hypothesized marine ice cliff instability, which actually in this study under very high greenhouse gas emissions exceeds 15 meters. And as yet, we cannot rule out that process, and therefore we included it as this low likelihood, high impact outcome. So I think I'd like to pass back to either Piers or Malta, I think, for this next session. Thank you.
It's Malta now. Go ahead, Malta. He just seemed to have kind of he seems to have kind of disappeared. He's away. Okay. I'm going to check that he's there. Are you there?
No, I'm here. All good. Now you can put your screen control on. I can't undo my video if I control your screen. I can't undo my video. That was the issue. So thank you very much. One slide back. Sorry for that hiccup. Thank you. You will have all seen this kind of hockey stick graph. So the last 2000 years of temperatures were relatively stable, and we saw here in the recent period just the instrumental record going up. So this is one SPM1 figure in the summary for policymakers, quite powerful. Before I proceed, however, I want to give a big shout out for not only all the people under that did work for this graph, but across the whole report, there were not only the lead authors that always are in the limelight, but also a bunch of chapter scientists and other colleagues, Zebedee Nichols, Jared Lewis, Sebastian Malinsky, Chris Smith, and many, many others more in the background. However, interestingly, we put this figure here, and you might remember in 1999, there was a big hoo-ha about a very similar figure, and that looked like this. There was Mann et al. So you see, the differences are not that stark. On the right side now, you have the pages 2K reconstruction. If we proceed, the question is really, how does it go into the future? And for that, in this report, we used 5 scenarios, and 5 scenarios are from the so-called SSP scenarios. I just give you a very brief introduction to those, and many of you know them already by heart. They follow roughly 5 different socioeconomic families. So socioeconomic developments in the world, either sustainability, middle of the road, regional rivalry, inequality, or fossil fuel development, or high growth development rather. And then if you pair that with mitigation, you can reach different climate futures. So one important point, also because it came up during the approval process of the SBM, is that these different socioeconomic futures are not one-to-one related to different climate outcomes. It's not only SSP1 that can reach you and give you low outcomes. It is also possible in the other socioeconomic developments to some degree. So that's important. Often you will see it represented in this kind of matrix. Now, the problem is that in Working Group 1, we rely on these big Earth system models, and they can only run a limited amount of time, and they're very heavy and very computational expensive. So we just chose these 5 scenarios here in white to run that you see here. But again, it does not mean that you have a very high scenario that is necessarily with that high growth development, or that all the SSP2 scenarios have to be kind of in the middle. I go further. There was one slide too much. One slide back. Very good. So in these scenarios, you see here the CO2 concentrations on the left. And here the one key thing to notice on the left graph is in the low scenario, that turquoise line that hits net zero CO2 emissions by around 2050, 2055, plus or give or take. And then the second lowest scenario is getting very low to net zero around 2070. So in both of them start to decline now, this decade. Otherwise, if you were not to decline this decade, then you would look at much steeper reduction rates thereafter, very steep indeed. So we look for 2050, you can do the math. We have around 30 years. Going 100% in 30 years gives you roughly a 3.5% reduction rate if you look at a linear line. And so then the middle scenario, the SSP245, is roughly representative of the NDCs that are currently on the table for 2030, which roughly have constant emission projection outwards. So consider the yellow line as roughly, okay, what is the plan at the moment for 2030? We do, however, have to acknowledge that those countries who put 2050 targets on the table, lots of them, actually around 60 of them, have net zero targets. They are very much in line with the lowest scenarios, SSP 119 and SSP 126. So these 2050 targets, they are fluffy and a bit in the future, but they are good. They are kind of in the line with these lowest scenarios. Whereas the 2030 targets, they are just not adequate and not on a path towards them. But just before I go on, you see here on the right also the methane. The big difference to CO2 is it doesn't go through zero because we have a lower bound of the emissions here. So roughly a halving in the lowest scenarios. Similar for nitrous oxide because we want to feed the people, and we have agriculture, and that is where these emissions are coming from, and we don't know at the moment the options to reduce it fully to zero. And then for aerosols, just here showing you the sulfate dioxide, and there's a much wider range. In the past, we had a much narrower one. Here, you saw the hockey stick graph from before that went to around the slower part, but now the future is wide. And here's only the raw model results shown, but this graph is really, the concentrations and temperatures have been really flat in the past, but in the future, in the next 300 years, there's a wide range of options open if we wanted to, but hopefully we keep it rather boring and flat. Next slide. Now, the actual temperatures under these 5 different scenarios are listed here in that table, and that first row is really key. Lots of discussion there. It depends a little bit on how you do the rounding with the historical warming that you add onto the projection, etc. But for that lowest scenario, it looks like it's around 1.6 degrees, so slight overshoot of 0.1 degree. I must say that has not been different to any other 1.5 degree scenario since the Paris Agreement. More or less, the UNEP emission gap report in 2015 had that kind of scenario classification. The UNFCCC synthesis report had that kind of scenario classification. The ESA, the special report on 1.5, had that kind of scenario classification, that you have a little bit of overshoot as peak temperatures in the middle of the century. And then the key thing is that you are again going below 1.5 by the end of it. And you see here the best estimate of 1.4 to the right for this lowest scenario. Now, of course, any extra temperature increase comes with warming, and comes with impacts, and some of these impacts are irreversible. So it's much better to keep the peak temperatures also below. Next slide. So the table was the temperature projections in a not so beautiful way, and here it's in the beautiful way. There have been other authors in the community non-IPCC that have presented very similar tables, but here in chapter 1 we put that together with Ed Hawkins, and then we thought, okay, let's put these 0 numbers on there. So you see here from 1750 to today in the classical stripe diagram of annual mean temperatures, what has been the temperature evolution over the observed past up to today. And then we basically have these 5 options from very high to very low. This little arrow indicates when the CO2 emissions are peaking, and then when they are halving, here with the halving symbol, and when they are going to net zero. So around 2050 for the slowest scenario. But key is it's not going to go back into the blue. Next slide. So one or many headlines that you see out there is saying, previous slide, is about the world to hit the temperature tipping point 10 years faster. And that is not true. In the special report on 1.5 degree, we also estimated that it is roughly around 2035 that in the lowest scenarios, our best estimate is then around the 1.5 degree mark. Of course, we already had 2 months in the past that were shooting above 1.5 degrees, and we will have individual years going above to 1.5 degrees, but in the long-term average, that is roughly 2035 when that is expected. But there's also a big range of potential futures that never hit 1.5 degrees in case that the Earth system is kind to us and the climate sensitivities are lower. Next slide. And here I also see Yuri Rogel is on the call. He is always championing the carbon budget numbers. So these are the carbon budget numbers now from chapter 5 of this report. Basic take-home message here is for 50%, 1.5 degrees, it's 500 gigatons. When IPCC tabled its first report in 1990, we roughly had 1,500 gigatons to 1.5 degrees. Now we burned through 2/3 of that up to now. So we burned around 1,000 gigatons over the last 30 years since 1990. Now we have 500 gigatons left. Not much. Yeah, you see here also the numbers for other warming levels or other probabilities. But I think if you're looking for the one number that is important for a policymaker, then let's consider here the 500. Next slide. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you to all of our working group one authors for unpacking some of those key messages from the report. And I think what really comes out is the importance of reducing emissions rapidly, which is particularly significant in the run-up to COP26, which is in just a few short months. So now that we've heard these inputs from our scientists, we turn to our panelists to hear their perspectives on the broader implications of the report. First, we have Tina Steege, Climate Envoy for the Marshall Islands. She also serves as the International Liaison for the Marshallese Educational Initiative. She has advocated on behalf of Marshallese and island communities for her entire career, focusing particularly on nuclear testing in the Pacific and the impacts of climate change in an atoll environment. And the floor is yours, Tina. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adele. And I just want to say at the very beginning to really recognize the work that science and these scientists in particular, but scientists all around the world have done to illuminate what the realities are, what the facts are, and inform our decisions about how we need to respond. This is something that, 1.5 was something that the islands fought for from the very beginning. And it was a victory to have that input to the Paris Agreement. And I think that it's very clear from this report that fight was not just necessary, but really critical. We know, particularly for vulnerable countries like mine, that 1.5 is really our best shot for survival. And this report shows that the window for 1.5 is very rapidly narrowing. However, that window is still there, and it's still very much worth fighting for. So with that, I just, I've been to years now of hearing the science, and each time the takeaway for me is both how sobering that science is, but also how much it needs to push us to do more. And certainly I think this report, as we've just heard, it shows that there's a need for deep, sustained, and fast reductions in emissions, not only in CO2, but other GHGs like methane, and that these have to be put in place to keep 1.5 degrees in sight. And we have to look to the major emitters to deliver these reductions. The scale and urgency of the crisis calls to leaders, but particularly those of the G20, which produce 80% of emissions globally, and particularly of those countries that have not yet declared enhanced targets. They must take bold steps to make reductions that might be difficult in the short term, but will pay dividends in the long term, and in the process save lives. For countries like mine, an atoll island nation, the risks are extreme. And this is particularly the case given the report's projections on sea level rise, which are higher than previously assessed. It makes it clear that sea level rise is certain to continue to get worse. We're expecting rise of up to 25 centimeters by 2050, whether or not we reduce emissions. And these changes, as we've heard, will not be reversible. You put into that equation projections around potentials, and I realize these are low likelihood but high impact projections of what might happen with the ice sheet melt. We could be looking at 5 meters by 2150. So even with the lower level scenarios that predict, and if we stay within 1.5 and predict about a 0.5 meter of sea level rise. Now that may not sound like much to some, but for a country like mine, which is just 2 meters above sea level, the implications are enormous, and the impacts are being felt already with the sea level rise that we've already seen. there are knock-on effects to sea level rise. This is not just about whether the sea lot rises, above the 2 meters that we have and the island disappears. This is actually about those sea level rise mixing with other things like storm surges and wave inundation and tidal flooding that affects our coastlines and essentially makes living in an atoll environment more and more precarious with each bit of sea level rise. So I think we really need to focus in where I'm coming from. We're going to focus on the fact that with 1.5 degrees, there is the ability to really limit sea level rise to between 0.28 and 0.55 meters by 2100. That's the lifeline that we need as we look toward the future. I think that also the findings show that adaptation is absolutely crucial and support the fact that we will need to build our resilience. But the fact is we're not on equal footing to respond to the impacts detailed in the report. We've heard in the past year growing calls for an even split between adaptation and mitigation funding. And this is a worthy target, but it can't stand on its own. The impacts laid out in this report provide evidence that we need to see a significant scaling up of adaptation funding that is in line with identified needs and a science-based estimate of costs that will be incurred. This report confirms that we will all feel the impacts of climate change, but vulnerable countries like mine will feel them first and the most acutely. We are going to see sea level rise, it's confirmed. So are extreme weather events, and we need the resources to take action on this information and prepare to keep our people safe. So just very quickly to end, I want to sort of think about where we go from here. For the Marshals, this report really reinforces the work we're doing already to look at our options. We're in the process of developing our national adaptation plan. And in December of last year, we submitted our adaptation communication to the UNFCCC. And we're really focusing on an inclusive process that consults widely around the country to develop this plan that really involves tough conversations with all members of our community to respond to the effects that are laid out in this report. It also reinforces our efforts to catalyze change in the international community and raise pressure on big emitters to take the steps necessary for our safety and for the safety of really the whole world. As some of you may know, the Marshall Islands does convene the High Ambition Coalition. Ministers of that coalition met at the end of July and put out some very clear messages as a result. First, we have to get the world on track for a 1.5 degree future. And we need to do that through enhanced NDCs that align with 1.5 and national policies like ending coal and halting fossil fuel subsidies that really turn targets into impact on the real economy. And the G20 has to take the lead on this. Second, we have to see an outcome at the COP that reflects the vital importance of adapting and building resilience to climate change. And finally, we have to make progress on climate finance to ensure that all countries have the means to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. Just in closing, I think that the report shows that the targets are what we need to be driving towards. The report really shows what the targets are that we need to be driving towards at the upcoming COP in Glasgow. And I really hope that it generates the sense of clarity of the crisis of this situation, the urgency of it, and the solidarity that we need to see in the next 83 days and beyond. Once again, I want to thank all of the scientists who work to produce this report. Coming from a background on nuclear testing in the Marshalls, I really understand what it's like when we don't have the information, when it's kept from us, when the scientific facts are classified, and it's therefore hard to understand a situation that you see right in front of your face and then get the rest of the world to hear and believe what you're saying. And that is not the case in climate change. It's the opposite. We have the scientists, we have those of us from the islands who have been living with this for years, shouting from the rooftops. And this report is the punctuation mark that we needed before we gather in Glasgow. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tina, for putting that report in context and expanding on what it means for particularly vulnerable countries and communities such as the small islands. Thank you. And then for our last presenter, we have Kaisa Kosonen, Senior Policy Advisor for Greenpeace Nordic and the IPCC focal point for Greenpeace International. She has over 20 years of experience in the field of climate advocacy and is also a member of the CONSTRAIN Stakeholder Committee. Thank you, Kaisa, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adele, and good day, everyone. I'm very honored to be part of this distinguished panel today. Now, there's been quite a lot of green reporting of this report so far, and that is all very much justified. But what I'm picking as the key messages from this report is that limiting warming to the Paris Agreement 1.5 goal is still feasible, and that by meeting the goal, we can still prevent a lot of the hazards and risks that loom ahead. So what we must do now is to make sure that governments address these findings and act on them before the next UN climate meeting, COP26 in Glasgow, because it is not about the decisions that will be taken at the COP. It is much more about the contributions that countries will bring to the COP. And currently those contributions don't add up. They don't deliver the emission cuts or support to the vulnerable we need. By 2030, in just 9 years, we would need to halve global emissions, but current policies would maintain emissions around current levels, eating up the remaining budget for 1.5. So before COP26, all countries and big emitters in particular, we need to address this gap and come with commitments that reflect their fair share of the halving by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. With support for the vulnerable, meeting and exceeding the $100 billion annually promised for developing countries, and they must come prepared to address adaptation and also the inconvenient question of limits to adaptation, the compensation structures for loss and damage, which this report reminds very painfully about. And finally, what we need is strong delivery of strong net zero targets. And what we don't need is greenwashing or weak carbon market rules that encourage dubious offsetting instead of accelerating action. We are in the midst of very crucial years. 9 years is an extremely short time for halving global emissions. And the decisions on fossil fuel phase-outs and investments that could enable that or prevent that from happening are being made right now. So we need to get the right investment signals in place right now and not in 5 or 10 years from now. And the COVID-19 recovery plans provide a perfect opportunity for that. So the gap where we're heading and where we should be heading for 1.5 might seem insurmountable. But when we zoom back to the bigger picture of what's new since the previous IPCC assessment report 7 or 8 years ago, the world has already changed a lot. Things that were considered impossible and far away back then are already becoming possible. Solar and wind are becoming the cheapest way to produce new electricity in most parts of the world. And this, combined with the falling prices of batteries, heat pump technology, and so forth, has the potential to change everything and free us of fossil fuels if we allow them to, by putting an end to the fossil economy. Even the IEA, an authoritative body that was once established to secure the supply of oil, is now seeing a pathway to 1.5 into an energy system dominated by solar and wind, coming with huge benefits, and finding that there should be no investments in new fossil fuel supply projects and no further final investment decisions for new unabated coal plants, and by 2035, no sales of new cars running on oil. And the financial sector has started to wake up. Some businesses are waking up. We've had climate becoming priority in elections. Targets and policies are being improved. So with current policies, we are still on track towards 3 degrees of warming, but with the very optimistic reading of targets and policies pledged and under consideration now, we are getting closer to 2 degrees. And by aligning the COVID-19 recovery plans with strong green recovery, we could get to the 1.5 path. So none of what is happening so far is enough, but all of it are signs of impossible becoming possible. And most importantly, all this change is happening because people have been calling for it, insisting on it, and campaigning for it. And COP26 will be a key moment, but that's not where we're stopping. Instead, we are taking the fight to the streets, to the capitals, and to the courtrooms. Worldwide, climate litigation continues to grow in importance as a way of advancing effective action on climate change. And in just 3 years, climate litigation cases have nearly doubled. And only last year, an unprecedented number of key judgments with potentially far-reaching impacts were issued, including in the groundbreaking cases against Shell and in the case against Germany. Now more than ever, climate litigation has become a real threat for governments and corporate polluters who don't align their action with 1.5. And the Shell decision reaffirms that the best available science, of which the IPCC reports form part of, set a new corporate climate action benchmark. And this fresh IPCC report gives us a new powerful tool for this work, with further evidence of the link between carbon emissions and worsening weather extremes and climate damage. So thank you, scientists, for that. There's a thought I once picked from Andrew Steer at WRI. It went along these lines. This is the moment when we must stop doing better and start doing enough. And I think this report is very much about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaisa, highlighting some of the policy implications and steps that we need to make both before and after COP26. So now we move into the question and answer period. I see that we've all been quite active in putting in questions, and so we'll get right into it. So the first few questions I will pose to Piers, and they come from Andreas Rodriguez, who wants to know about the special report on 1.5 degrees. States that in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by a certain percentage. And does the AR6 report change that expectation or not? Also, please answer from Tatiana, who wants to know about the life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions, and is it possible to reverse scary climate impacts that we've discussed previously? And then finally, one by Ton Wildenborg, who wants some further information on if paleoclimatic information has been considered in the statements about sea levels. Thanks, Piers.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, the first thing is that is a very excellent question about does the kind of 45% cut in the next 10 years from the SL 1.5 report, is that still current? And the answer is absolutely yes. So this report very much confirms that those pathways from the 1.5 report were pretty accurate. But the report goes a little bit further than that. It actually able to significantly constrain the uncertainty. So yes, we even have more confidence that that 45% is correct. And in fact, that also does relate to the answer to Tatiana's question. In fact, we have more confidence in this report that if we do achieve these net zero carbon dioxide emissions, then the contribution of kind of further temperature increase related to carbon dioxide will also not go up. And that is because we understand more about the feedback from permafrost, and we understand how the natural system will compensate. So we are indeed going to get increases in carbon dioxide after reaching net zero, kind of from the thawing of permafrost and from fires, but kind of fortunately the best evidence that point to the natural system being kind to us, and these vast swathes of kind of forest across Siberia and Canada and North America will actually grow a lot better in the high levels of carbon dioxide. And they are predicted to more than compensate for that by sucking up the extra carbon. So that's the good news about it, but does in fact make the 1.5-degree target very slightly easier in a kind of physical science sense than it was in the SO 1.5 report. And just to answer the off-piece question about the last interglacial from Ton, you are correct, Tom. The last, in the last interglacial, the kind of sea level was anything between 5 or 10 meters, and it is today. But in fact, that isn't very compatible to the projections out to 2300, because what we're talking about is the kind of sea level rise occurring over a much shorter time, and at the last interglacial, in fact, that was a kind of sea level rise associated with a much longer time kind of period of change. Okay, I'll pass back now to Del.
Great, thanks, Piers. So our next question comes from Jeff Vogel, and he has 2 questions specifically for Malta. Firstly, the net zero 2050 targets of high emitting countries are in line with the SSP 1 to 1.9 at a global average, but are they in line with equity and climate justice, which we know are very important topics? And also one of the graphs showed high end temperature rise greater than 10 degrees Celsius for 2100 to 2300. And could you please elaborate a bit on that? Thanks, Malta.
Yes, and I'm sure Piers and others can come in as well. On that first point, net zero targets for high emitting countries. So around 60 countries have net zero targets, including US and China, but it's fully correct. Not all countries have them, and also the countries that tend to have very low per capita emissions at the moment and did have in the past also don't have them necessarily yet. So absolutely, there's an equity question. However, the Working Group 1 report is looking at the geophysical connection between emissions and temperatures. So in the Working Group 1 report, you won't find any discussion on which country should do how much. And therefore, I would also refrain here from going further into that. That is something that will be touched upon, however, in the forthcoming Working Group 3 report that is coming out early next year. On the second part of the question, the high temperature rise, you should absolutely note that this graph that I showed you is just the raw model output of the Earth system models. Now, AR6, this report got much more sophisticated in analyzing all these so-called big climate models, the Earth system models, together with other lines of evidence. That was actually done here by Piers in his chapter 7 with the other lines of evidence, and then combined in chapter 4. So no, don't take the individual model projections as any assessed range or any assessed projection. That is showing you just the raw output. If you believe a certain model, and some of them have high climate sensitivities, then yes, they produce crazy high temperatures by 2300 in a crazy high emission scenario. We have to be clear that with the current development, and especially with the low cost of renewables, the very high part of the emission scenarios, the SSP 585, for example, is not really considered to be on the books anymore, unless we see some unforeseen climate feedbacks or we really pump money into trying to get really high emissions. But the economics changed. So as I said before, the economics are rather in a flat intermediate emission scenario. So we still look from a geophysical perspective at these scenarios, but no, don't take more than 10 degrees as a projection. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Malta. We do have a question from Anne Sietsma, who says, as a PhD student and activist, the possibility of low likelihood, high impact events is especially difficult to find the right language around. How does IPCC approach finding the right level of alarm to sound around this? And open that to any of you to answer.
Okay, wait a minute. I was trying to answer a question in the chat, so didn't quite catch that. Yeah, I've just seen it in the chat, so perhaps I can give it a go. And it's yeah, we had a big debate about what was the right kind of wording. I do think a lot of us quite like the low likelihood, kind of high impact kind of wording, but in fact, quite a few of us are quite concerned about this idea of tipping points, just because a lot of changes like permafrost and these other things, they are very important, significant, often irreversible things. But I think this idea of a tipping point doesn't necessarily convey the right thing, that we don't want to see 1.5 degrees as a very hard kind of cutoff, that if we were to go above that, then everything will be a catastrophe. So kind of what we don't want to do is kind of shoot past 1.5 degrees. So we want to hopefully try and keep as close to 1.5 degrees as possible and limit additional warming. But I do think we oughtn't to get too caught up on these big risks that might occur by the end of the century. I mean, what the report tells us is that if we can cut emissions to net zero as fast as possible, that is the best way of limiting these big catastrophic events. So I just think it puts more emphasis on getting to net zero as fast as possible. But yeah, well, I think I'll keep it like that for now.
Great, thank you, Piers. And for Malta, could you elaborate a bit on the differences of the budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius compared to the special report on 1.5 degrees? So what does this AR6 tell us that is different or the same as the 1.5 report?
Lovely. And Piers or Yuri, who is, I think, in the audience, can also, or can much better answer that question, but as a quick summary, the median estimates are pretty much the same. And the estimates which have a 67% likelihood or high likelihood, for example, because they try to be away from that temperature threshold, because depending on how broad the likelihood is, given that we narrowed now the uncertainty, they are now a little bit higher, simply because we narrowed the uncertainty. If we had narrowed the uncertainty completely, then they would be the same as the 50% one, but we didn't do so yet. So the 50% budget numbers that you find there in the table are pretty much spot on with SR 1.5 for a rather complex set of offsetting reasons, but the 67% is slightly larger. I hope that answered that question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I think we have a question that's, I think, quite important, which is what can the world's community do to induce bad actors to implement effective measures to reduce or eliminate their contributions to global warming? So the report really highlights the implications of continued global warming and what can we do to get bad actors to get to the net zero. Tina, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Thank you, Adela. I'll do my best. I think first off, we need a chorus of good actors. We need essentially the best actors to be putting their best foot forward, particularly within that critical group of the G20, and showing leadership with 1.5 aligned targets that can place and put the pressure on the laggards and those who are dragging their feet. And you know, that's how the multilateral system works, through that peer pressure. And this report does do a great deal to help place that pressure by illuminating the very grim realities that we're all facing. But at the same time, I think it was mentioned, like that we also need the actions that we're seeing more and more from civil society in the courts to increase that pressure. The pressure really needs to come from all sectors in order to push us much faster than we've been moving, and to give everyone the kick we need. But the Marshalls has always worked from the idea that essentially we all need to take part. We all need to do as much as we can possibly do. And I just come back to, and maybe others have heard this before, but we have an expression that Tony DeBroom, who is our climate champion, who has since passed on, often used to describe what needs to be done. And he would say, you know, the ocean is made up of many drops. And, you know, if I take care of mine, you take care of yours, and he takes care of his, she takes care of hers, we'll take care of the entire ocean. And that's what needs to be done. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tina. Very excellent analogy. And I think on that note, we can close. So thank you for all of you for attending, and thank you to all of our panelists and speakers for your insights. It really helped to bring the report to life, to get further into the key messages and for what it means for more broadly. So the recording of this webinar will be posted on the CONSTRAIN website. Also on the CONSTRAIN website are other materials that provide guidance and explanatory help to further understand the Working Group 1 reports and other advances in climate science. It's a really helpful resource. I encourage you all to review those resources. So with that, thank all of you for attending, and goodbye for now.